This is the story of an unlikely friendship between a crime reporter, Peter R. de Vries, and Cor van Hout, a kidnapper and lifelong criminal. The two men formed a bond that was not expected, given their vastly different backgrounds and lifestyles. 7th of March 1984, the court in Paris. It had been 4 months since the resolution of the high-profile Heineken kidnapping case, which captivated the attention of the public due to its military-like execution. Journalist Peter had been covering the case from the beginning and quickly traveled to Paris upon learning of the kidnappers' capture. The plan was to have them extradited to the Netherlands for trial, with a French judge overseeing the proceedings. Sitting in the front row of the courtroom, Peter had a feeling that one of the defendants, Cor, was the mastermind behind the crime, though little was known about the internal dynamics of the group. Cor, at only 27 years old, was the same age as journalist Peter, who couldn't help but be surprised by the young age of someone capable of committing such a high-profile crime. As the judge conducted the proceedings, Cor surveyed the courtroom and took note of the press tribune, where Peter was seated. The two had never met before, yet when their eyes met, there was a strange feeling of familiarity. Cor acknowledged Peter with a nod, to which Peter responded with a raised eyebrow. This would be the beginning of an unusual connection between the two. Over the next several weeks, the odd interactions between Peter and Cor continued. Eventually, Peter decided to reach out to Cor in jail by writing him a letter, trying to maintain a neutral and cautious tone by starting with a simple "Hello, Cor." He was, after all, a journalist, and written extensively about the case. So Peter figured, he wouldn't be his favorite person to communicate with. In his reporting, Peter had portrayed Cor and Willem as ruthless criminals, so it would have been hypocritical for him to act friendly in his letter. Therefore, he chose to keep his tone as neutral as possible. He referred to the peculiar interactions they had in court, where their eyes met multiple times, and he felt they had established some kind of connection. He requested an interview with Cor to uncover the mysteries surrounding the case and to understand how it all began. Despite his skepticism, Peter did not have high hopes that the letter would reach Cor or that he would receive a response, as Cor was probably not expecting such a request at this time. At the next court hearing, Cor passes Peter, and thanked him for the letter. But nothing told Peter he would get a reply. After a wait of more than 90 days, Peter finally received a letter from the prison where Cor was being held, the Rue de la Santé. Cor began his letter in a similarly neutral tone, "Hello Peter," and explained that he hoped Peter could read his handwriting as he was writing on his bed. He mentioned that he had read Peter's book about the case, but wasn't particularly pleased with it as it contained mistakes and had a positive view of the police. He also mentioned that if it wasn't for an anonymous tip, they might still be free. At this point in time, Cor was not ready for an interview and wanted to wait until the trial was over. However, he promised that if anyone got an interview, it would be Peter. Cor also asked if it would be possible for Peter to send him a copy of the newspaper, The Telegraph, so he could keep up with news of Ajax and what was happening in the Netherlands. Peter agreed and started sending the newspaper. There was just one problem: France and the Netherlands had some issues about the extradition process. And so long this wasn't resolved, Willem and Cor would stay in jail there. 2 years went by before any resolution came to light, but during this time, Peter remained faithful to his promise and continued to send newspapers to Cor. They continued to correspond through letters, with Peter inquiring about Cor's life in jail. Cor described being locked up with 4 French men in a small cell measuring only 2 by 3 meters. Peter proposed writing a book about the case, but Cor advised that it would be better to wait until they were back in the Netherlands. Cor then changed the topic and mentioned that he had earned the nickname the Flying Dutchman due to his impressive running speed in the prison yard. Peter observed that despite the harsh and medieval conditions of the jail, Cor maintained a sense of humor. Cor anticipated that he would eventually be extradited to a prison in the Netherlands, likely the Bijler jail. But that didn't happen. In the first week of December, 1985, they were placed under house arrest in a motel in Beauvais, near Paris. It was called La Vision Verte, the Green Escape. As soon as he heard the news, Peter rushed to the location of the kidnappers and was among the first members of the press to arrive. As he parked his car, he saw Cor walking by. Cor had lost a significant amount of weight and there had been no court hearings for months. Cor thanked Peter for sending the newspaper to him for such a long time. Reporters from all over the world converged on the motel, all vying for an interview with the kidnappers. But none of them were successful. However, a French police officer approached Peter and asked him to come with him. Cor told Peter that he was the only one who would get an interview with them. He said he had made a promise and intended to keep it. That night, they dined together at the hotel restaurant, drinking Heineken beer with their meal. Over the next few days, they got to know each other better, with the relationship being cordial but cautious. Every day, Peter wrote about the case in the newspaper, but Cor wasn't thrilled about it, feeling that Peter's coverage was too critical and negative. From time to time, Cor and Willem would come to visit Peter in his room to chat and hang out. They would talk about things like Amsterdam or how the Ajax soccer team had been playing in their recent matches. Both sides were a bit cautious in their interactions. Peter found the whole situation to be surreal, as he had always imagined what these people would be like in person. And now here they were, sitting in his room. It was the end of the year 1985, and many reporters had left to go home for the holidays, as they didn't expect any updates on the case to happen soon. But Peter decided to stay, as he figured that when everyone else leaves, that's when you have to be there. On New Year's Eve, the motel was completely abandoned. Cor and Willem invited Peter to their room. They talked a bit, but there was no TV in the room and no New Year's Eve atmosphere. They did have 2 bottles of champagne that they would open at midnight. It was an uneasy feeling and a terrible New Year's Eve in a cheap motel. But they all knew for sure that no one would forget this New Year's Eve. In many ways, Peter and Cor were very similar. They were both tall, had blonde hair, were athletic, were fans of the Ajax soccer team, were non-smokers, and were from Amsterdam. However, Cor was a kidnapper and Peter was a law-abiding journalist. But as Peter got to know Cor better, he learned that Cor was exceptionally intelligent and witty. On February 12, 1986, Peter received a phone call from Cor asking him to come right away because something was about to happen. Cor claimed that Heineken had sent secret agents to follow them around. This turned out to be true. The way Cor found out was clever. He noticed that one of the rooms in the motel had a car parked in front of it with a sticker from a car rental company and the curtains were always closed, which was unusual in a business motel. Cor had built up a good relationship with the manager of the motel and asked if he could take a look in the guest register, which the manager allowed him to do. There he discovered, the man in the room was a Dutch man, named Van der Meer. He asked if there were any phone calls made from the room, and obtained a record of all the outgoing calls. There were many calls made to a number in Katwijk. When they called the number themselves, it turned out to be a company named Proseco. Cor disguised his voice and asked how things were going. The person on the other end, Van der Meer, responded by saying that he wasn't sure, but he thought they were on to them, and that they had been seen looking through the windows that morning. This confirmed that Heineken had been following them and that Proseco was a security firm that Heineken had hired. As time went on, there were developments in the extradition process. When Peter arrived at the motel, Cor showed him a letter stating that they would be extradited to the French island of Guadeloupe. Guadeloupe is an archipelago in the Caribbean, an overseas department and region of France, and an integral part of France and the European Union. Peter immediately phoned this information back to the Netherlands to the newspaper and ordered a ticket to travel there. Several French detectives fly along, and there would be a transfer flight to St. Martin after landing. Cor was wary of the situation and wondered why they were just hearing about this now. He questioned if this was a trick or some kind of setup. Willem talked to a passenger on the plane and realized that St. Martin was actually Sint Maarten in Dutch and was a part of the Netherlands. Even though the extradition was getting closer, Cor had a plan. Upon landing, he informed the officers that there were reporters with them on the flight and that if they did something strange, it would be in the newspapers the next day. As a result, they decided to fly to another island. This time it was Saint Barthélemy, which is a part of France. However, Peter and his photographer were not allowed to come with them. Peter tried to contact all possible authorities and government agencies to find out more information, but he hit a roadblock as no one was talking. Determined not to be stopped, Peter flew to Sint Maarten, booked a room in an international hotel in the main town and capital Marigot, and continued to call all the phone numbers he could think of to find out more information, but again he got no more information. After a long and exhausting day, it was time for a break. Just after midnight, they decided to go to the bar for a drink. As they were exiting the hotel, the door to the opposite room opened and it was Cor. A massive coincidence. They could have been on any of the islands in the region, but luck had it that they were on the same floor, in the same hotel. A very hectic week was about to follow. They traveled from island to island on small planes in search of a place where they could stay. But they were not welcome anywhere. As soon as the local press got involved and began writing about them, riots broke out because of their presence. Meanwhile, Heineken's security staff had also arrived at the hotel where they were staying and they were likely not going to be shy about exposing their location to the press. A French police officer warned them that they should go into hiding or they would be lynched by the mob that had formed. To avoid detection, they followed a small service staircase and ended up in a small television room in the basement. They lay low on the ground, behind some furniture, with no lights on, hoping they wouldn't be discovered. The crowd searched every corner of the hotel, looking for them, but they remained still and quiet. Cor advised Peter that it might be best for him to leave as the situation could become dangerous. Peter responded by saying that he was a reporter, not a runner. Willem commented on how nice it was, the life of a criminal. They stayed put in the little room until midnight, when the angry mob had dispersed, and the police smuggled them out of the hotel to a small port where a motorboat was waiting to take them to a ship further out at sea. After about an hour of sailing, they arrived at the island Tintamar, where they were picked up by an army helicopter. The helicopter brought them back to Guadeloupe, where they took shelter in a remote villa. Cor noticed that there was a lot of Nazi-related reading material present. A few days later, the news broke that the kidnappers were back and riots broke out again. As a result, they were flown back to Paris. As things calmed down again, Peter approached Cor about writing a book about the Heineken kidnapping. He believed it was a good time since their relationship had grown during the hectic times they shared together. Peter also pointed out that he had stayed with them even when things got dangerous. He urged Cor to make a decision soon, as they might be taken to jail again and the extradition was approaching. The next day Cor told Peter that he had thought about it all night and that it might not be a good idea to reveal all his secrets to a reporter. However, he agreed to proceed with the book. Peter took 4 weeks off, booked a room at the Ibis Hotel and everywhere Cor and Willem were staying. And they began telling him every detail and how they executed their plans. To not waste any time, they had food delivered to the room and often talked until late into the night. Peter wanted to know every little detail, who did what happened after that, why, how, and so on. The book, when it was released after the trial, would be a hit, but for now, everything had to stay secret as the trial was still ongoing. Cor still had to give the final approval for the book when it was finished. When Peter asked Cor if he regrets the kidnapping, Cor replied, "Peter, we prepared for this job for 2 years. It's not something we did lightly. If you say now that you regret it, you're a crybaby. And it's not a question to ask of those who got caught. Of course, they did something wrong, and if they hadn't been caught, they probably wouldn't regret anything. But if there's anything he shouldn't have done, it's probably to not kidnap Heineken's driver. That was wrong." It took Peter 3 weeks to process all the information, and he traveled back to the Netherlands to put it into book form. Meanwhile, Cor and Willem returned to jail to await their extradition. Peter and Cor continued to communicate through letters, but now they shared a secret code. The running is going well, meaning that the book he was working on was progressing. In October 1986, Cor and Willem were extradited and ended up in the Bijlmer jail. The trial began in February 1987. A month after the trial, Peter had finished the book and smuggled it into the jail for Cor to read and approve. After reading it, Cor flushed it in the toilet. When Peter visited him, Cor told him that he finished the book in one go because he was so curious about the ending. Eventually, they were sentenced to 11 years in jail without saying a word in court. Their comment was that they would talk at a time and in a way that they would decide later. This referred to the book that was to be released. The book revealed a lot and shocked the Netherlands and the world. Peter continued to visit them in jail at least once a month and kept in touch through phone conversations. On April 27, 1998, Cor had finished his sentence and was released. At 7 in the morning, he was standing in front of the bridge at the Isle Lake, where the prison was located. Peter visited him when he was released, and asked him if he remembered the first sentence of the book. Cor replied, "The champagne was ready." They stared at the lake without speaking. A lot had happened in the past years and they chatted about what the future might bring. Some of the ransom money from the Heineken case had been laundered in casinos and brothels. Cor was not able to enjoy his money for long, as in May 1998. He was convicted for being the leader of a criminal organization and served another 4 years in prison. He was no longer friends with Willem Holleeder at this time. On January 24, 2003, Peter was working at his desk when he received a phone call from Boss, a friend and bodyguard of Cor. Boss told Peter that Cor had been shot and it was bad. He thought he was dead. Peter rushed to the scene of the crime, but was not allowed to come any closer. Cor had survived 2 previous attempts on his life. But his luck finally ran out. Peter reflected on the unique friendship that had formed between himself and Cor, despite the fact that Cor was a kidnapper and criminal. Cor had once told Peter that he didn't have to act any better than he was, because Peter knew exactly what he had done. As a tribute, Peter published a morning ad in the newspaper and spoke at Cor's funeral. He said that Cor was the most special person he had ever met in his life. And that crime had brought them together and ultimately pulled them apart. After Peter publicly expressed his condolences for Cor's passing, he faced backlash from the press for showing sympathy towards a kidnapper and criminal. He was criticized for not putting up a facade of condemnation, and it was suggested that it would have been better for him to have pretended to be a hypocrite rather than being honest about his feelings.